Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to go here. It looks like we're in faithful remnant territory here. Feel free to move up to the front if you'd like. I'm Joe Creech, and I direct the Lilly Network of Church-Related Colleges and Universities, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the Carl F.H. Henry Lecture, which in this case will involve 3 papers and then conversation about the topic Christian higher education as a communal means of grace. And I look forward to hearing from our 3 panelists, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will present their papers. These are brief papers, and you can read their full bios in the symposium program. But first, we'll hear from Dr. Alison Noble, who is Professor of Chemistry and Interim Provost at Messiah University. And then we'll hear from Dr. Shirley Mullen, who is President Emerita of Houghton College. And finally, Amos Yong, who is Dean of the School of Mission and Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. And I'd like to make a few introductory remarks before Professor Noble presents her paper. I'm delighted to hear this group of speakers as they explore the way institutions and individuals in Christian higher education create physical, spiritual, and intellectual spaces to generously navigate differences in this age of discord. And I especially appreciate the diversity that they bring in terms of their disciplinary expertise coming from the natural sciences, humanities, and theology, their faith traditions coming from Brethren in Christ, Wesleyan, and Pentecostal, the types of institutions they represent, both Theological Seminary and then institutions of applied and liberal arts, and their situatedness in the university. Provost, president, dean, all of whom have served on faculty. In addition, I'd like to make a few points of definition I think would be appropriate. First, by using the term Christian higher education, we mean to include institutions that have as part of their mission or identity an explicit element of the Christian faith or relationship to the church. What we have in mind are those institutions that Robert Benny, in his widely known book, Quality with Soul, would describe as either orthodox institutions, that is, those institutions where the academic personnel agree to a statement of belief, and as well, critical mass institutions, that is, universities where Christian identity or heritage is carried on by a particular subset of the personnel or designated campus institutes. For Benny, those 2 categories would include the institutions he studied in this book. That was Calvin University, Wheaton College, St. Olaf College, Valparaiso University, the University of Notre Dame, and the institution that is hosting this symposium, Baylor University. These are the kinds of institutions we have in mind, that the speakers have in mind as being constitutive of Christian higher education. And second, what do we mean by the term means of grace? Here we're referring to a theological or linguistic frame from the Wesleyan tradition. John Wesley describes the means of grace as signs, words, or actions ordained of God that are channels of conveying God's grace to the souls of persons. And so without further ado, I'll now turn things over to Dr. Noble.
Thank you, Joe. All right, well, in her debut novel, Lessons in Chemistry, Bonnie Garmis tells the story of Elizabeth Zott, a hilariously deadpan, markedly literal, and unfailingly rational caricature of a stereotypical chemist who has the unfortunate timing of being a female scientist in the 1950s. 2 different friends gave this book to me for Christmas last year, and I'm trying not to interpret that as having any kind of indirect meaning for me. But I do recommend it to anyone who is a chemist, knows and loves a chemist, or knows someone who loves a chemist. It's actually a great book. Also, philosophers could enjoy it. If you prefer the small screen version, the story was also just released as a miniseries on Apple TV. One of the things I appreciate about the heroine, Miss Zott, is her authenticity. She knows who she is, and she's faithful to. One of the many somewhat absurd but very funny manifestations of this centers upon, of all things, a bullet-ruined tombstone of her partner Calvin Evans, where it originally contained a partial quote from Marcus Aurelius. Natural scientists do have a soft spot for the Stoics. In the repair job, she, and this is in her words, forgoes a second round with Aurelius and replaces it instead with a chemical response that results in happiness. The inscription reads as follows. I did say it was a caricature. Interestingly, this is the structural formula for oxytocin, which is sometimes referred to as the love hormone. My point here isn't actually about chemistry, not at all. It's about perspective and its relationship to discord. Take, for example, this other designation here. It's a standard wedge and line rendering of the molecule oxytocin. Instead of focusing on the way the atoms are connected, like the first image did, this one elucidates the shape of the molecule. Both of these are oxytocin, well, representations of oxytocin. But they look really different, even though they're both correct. Even a chemist would need to examine them to recognize them as the same thing. They have different foci and they serve different purposes. I'll frame my comments today about Christian higher education as communal means of grace from metaphors in natural science that get at two core principles, along with a few pragmatic examples. First, and I've already arrived at this metaphor, is the role that perspective plays in discord. We look at the same things and we see them differently. We explain them differently, we understand them differently. Discord is the natural state of affairs. The second principle is about space, creating space to hold and process the tension that naturally arises from discord. So now for a new metaphor about space. Recall a moment near the seashore when you became aware of the fragrance of the ocean, or the experience of being nearby when someone opens a bottle of whiskey or nail polish remover, or seeing the condensation above a lake or a river in the fall. For the examples with smell, have you ever thought, don't the molecules actually have to be in my nose for me to smell them? Actually, they do. Why is it that I can smell a liquid when it's far away from me? And the lake, what's condensing above the surface? It's water. Most people would answer that. Say, yeah, it's water condensing above the surface of the lake. But why isn't the water in the lake like it's supposed to be? It's gas-phase water right above the lake that condenses to form that fog. All of these are examples of what we call vapor pressure. For every liquid, most of the substance is, in fact, liquid, like we expect. But some of that liquid is also in the gas phase, right above the surface of the liquid. And that's what vapor pressure describes, the pressure of the gas right above the liquid. And it's something we can measure in the lab. But it involves volatile liquids, heating volatile liquids, and pretty significant pressure interchanges. So making those measurements requires that we create space. Without space, the liquid can flash into the vapor phase in an uncontrolled way. An uncontrolled and chemistry lab is generally a pairing I prefer to avoid. The setup I use with students looks like this. But the most important part of this setup for today's purpose is this one. In one way, it's nothing special at all. In another way, it's indispensable. The key element here is called a ballast volume. At least in this situation, it's called a ballast volume. In others, we'd call it a round bottom flask. But today, it's a ballast volume. Perhaps you're most familiar with the word ballast in its relationship to ships. There's a similarity. In the context of ships, it's often rocks or other heavy substances that provide stability in the build of a ship. In the vapor pressure experiment, the ballast volume is in fact a big, empty volume. Its express purpose is to provide a large holding tank so that the pressure doesn't change too quickly. It enables the system to stabilize and come to equilibrium after every adjustment, preventing liquid from flashing uncontrollably into the gas phase. This then is the second principle, and I state it not as something that's accomplished perfectly, but instead as something that ought to be and sometimes is. Institutions of Christian higher education have the potential and calling to be a means of grace in a time of global, national, and local discord by serving as ballast volumes for human interactions. Why Christian higher education? Because they are intellectual training ground, characterized by curiosity, exploration, and intellectual humility. If you move that mic over, it'll stop the feedback. No, this one. Because at their best, they elevate the cultivation of virtue, including gratitude, temperance, and patience, defining features of an interpersonal ballast volume. Because they're explicitly communities of faith, centering spiritual life, sensitive and faithful to Jesus' call to us in the Sermon on the Mount, a call that includes humility, gentleness, listening, and reconciliation. What better picture of a ballast volume, a communal means of grace in a polarized age, than what we describe here, the Christian university as it ought to be and sometimes is. It would be easy, far too easy now, to offer a critique of how Christian higher education does not live up to its ideals, how it does not serve as a ballast, but instead contributes to the vitriol of the day. But that's not my purpose here. My purpose is a reminder that despite its failings, there remains both potential and call for Christian higher education, and from here to give two small but hopeful pragmatic examples, the pragmatic part of this offering, that remind us that ballast volumes of our day are created by the dedication of individuals, that those individuals creating those spaces join in the communication of God's grace. This pragmatic example is from an administrative lens. The previous provost at Messiah, an analytic philosopher by discipline, retired a year and a half ago after 18 years of service as a provost. Given that the current average lifespan of a provost is around 4 years, a tenure of 18 is pretty remarkable. Upon his retirement, he was commemorated in many ways, but I'm sure that the deepest, most meaningful one, something that signifies unyielding conviction in our society, we created a t-shirt. On the front of the t-shirt was a favorite emblem of his. He even had a stuffed animal rendering that he kept in his office, the bunny duck, or the duck rabbit. It's called both, has different names appropriately. An ambiguous image that can be seen either as a bunny or a duck, depending on how you look at it. The image was made famous by Wittgenstein and was also used by Thomas Kuhn as a metaphor for the paradigm shift that occurs in scientific revolutions, when the same information is suddenly seen in an entirely different way. In the context of Christian higher ed, provosts often find themselves caught between different perspectives: board perspectives, president perspectives, faculty perspectives, student, alumni, parents. It's a role of the in-between. And even if each person is completely faithful to their perception, like oxytocin, it can seem very, very different. Keeping the illustrative truth of the bunny duck at the forefront, not only in my own way of thinking, but in taking the time to educate others to it, is a pragmatic practice that allows for mediation and mutual understanding. It is undeniably an administrative means of grace, one that was given to me by a mentor and friend, and that I now find myself in a role to share with others. And now for the back of the t-shirt. What else? A diagram. It's an extension of Benny's work that Joe referenced in his introduction. Messiah University, like many but not all institutions, is what Benny referred to as an orthodox institution. That is, all faculty have some core set of beliefs that they affirm. And at Messiah, it's the Apostles' Creed. But there are a wide range of beliefs that Christians hold that go into much more detail than what's in the Apostles' Creed. A perennial struggle in Christian higher education is how to balance unity of belief, the identity of a particular college or university, with the diversity of belief, the reality that many Christian members of the community believe a lot of different things. There are trade-offs at any institution between how many things you hold as core. What are the things that, when we look at the diagram, everybody at the university agrees to, and how much is neutral, things that people can disagree on and bring diversity of belief. The diagram could be longer in the core and shorter in the neutral, or shorter in the core and longer in the neutral. Institutions vary on this. The previous provost made an extension of Benet's model. Benet's model does not have the BC zone. It has the AB and then it has the core zone and the neutral zone. But what we see here is that there is a balanced volume of space of beliefs that are less than core and more than neutral. These are beliefs that define institutional identity, that educators treat respectfully, but are not required to personally believe. In the diagram, they are this BC belief. They're the ballast volume of belief. For example, Messiah has a covenant relationship with the Brethren in Christ Church, which is an historic peace tradition. This is part of the institutional identity. We expect members not to undermine that. While at the same time, we fully embrace Christians who are not from peace traditions, who have served in the military or published scholarly work that supports frames such as just war theory. This is a model that overtly defines an intentional ballast volume. It names the truth that discord is the natural state of things, and in so doing provides space and a framework for understanding and navigating differences, for living in tension without resorting to schism. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share some ways that a chemist provost thinks about recognizing perspective and creating space, describing a vision of how Christian higher education at its best can serve as communal means of grace. And with that, I'm looking forward to hearing a different perspective on the same topic from my friends and colleagues.
Thank you, Alison. That was a great start. So at the beginning of this summer, when Alison asked if I would join this panel, and she sent me the paragraph describing what the panel was about, I immediately resonated with it, and I began to think of all of the ways in which we in Christian higher education are called to do this mediating, bridge-building work. And I've been thinking a great deal in my own journey about the ways in which Christian higher education has unique gifts to do translation between the right and the left of our society today. We understand the world of evangelicalism and all the things that are part of what most people think of as the right, and yet we also understand a lot of the things that would be associated with the left. And so I've been thinking about that metaphor of translation, and I immediately began, again, to go down that list of all of the assets that we have in this work. But I quickly remembered my reading at the beginning of the summer. So as a good humanities person, I will resort to books, not molecules. So let me hold up my two books here. The first was a biography of Derek Parfit, a 20th century Oxford philosopher. He was the child of Chinese missionaries, but basically had departed from his Christian faith, and he has set himself the task, according to the author, of finding a foundation for objective morality that was not grounded in theism. So that's a pretty complicated task, and that was one book. And then the second book that I read right after that was Lost in Thought by Zena Hitz, also a philosopher, also an ethicist, although working more in the classical tradition than the modern analytic tradition. Now, both of these books reminded me of the gift of the pursuit of knowledge and that wonderful invitation that we all have from Genesis to explore with great joy every tree of the garden, and also reminded me of the stewardship that we are called to in Christian higher education. This is not something we do for ourselves, it's for others. But despite what these two books had in common in terms of being intellectually enriching, and perhaps even potential means of grace in their intellectual content, what struck me immediately, and particularly in light of preparing for this talk, was the radically different impact that these two scholars, Derek Parfit and Zena Hitz, have had on the communities around them. And this leads me to my comment that despite all of the amazing resources that we have, there's nothing automatic about the notion that even Christian higher education is going to be a means of grace for those involved. Professor Parfit, despite his great intellectual gifts, was a very difficult person interpersonally, and for all of those he worked with and all of those even who loved him in his family. He symbolized in many ways what I think of as the operation of power within the world of Christian higher education. And though we might think that we escape this in the world of Christian higher education, I would contend that it's evident in our world as much as in the larger world of higher education. In Professor Parfit's life, it's evident in the sense that he could afford to demand, both implicitly and explicitly, that others operate according to his perfectionist principles. That if they wished to have what he had to offer, they had to operate on his timetable. And so while the author of his biography offers a very sympathetic and appreciative picture of Professor Parfit, I have to admit, I was really depressed when I finished the book. I felt that there was a tragedy there, that somehow, in the light of his great intellectual gifts, which included not only his ability in philosophy, but he was also a very accomplished photographer and appreciator of beauty, there was something tragic that the gifts that God had given him had not been incarnated more fully in an embodied life. Professor Hitz, on the other hand, chose deliberately and voluntarily to exchange the high-powered work of the academy, in which she could have continued to rise in the way that Professor Parfit had at Oxford. She happened to be at McGill University at the time. She chose to trade that world for the privilege of teaching undergraduates as a generalist in the context of an institution of the great books. Furthermore, she has given leadership to the formation of what's called the Catherine Project, a nonprofit organization in Maryland that seeks to make the life-giving riches of the great books available to the world at large. All of the people who will never have the academic resources or the time to appropriate the gifts of the academy inside that world. So in Professor Hitz's case, it's the very opposite of asking the world to operate around her. She's strategizing how to give away the gift of the life of the mind. She's choosing, in short, to mediate the gifts of learning in a spirit of love and gratitude, rather than a spirit of entitlement and power. We might say that she's adopting a posture of invitation and hospitality rather than argumentation and entitlement. My point here is not to compare in every way Professor Hitz and Professor Parfit. I appreciated both of the gifts that they brought to me, and in that sense, they are means of grace. But my point here is to draw attention to the fact that if the work of Christian higher education is to be a means of grace, it will not happen automatically. It will involve the conscious choice and the agency of everyone involved. It must be a choice. It is not going to happen by default. So that's my first point. It doesn't happen by accident. It's only by intent and choice. My second point, and closely related, is that this choosing to be agents of grace, it will be complicated. And Alison's already hinted at this, but I want to develop a little bit more. It will involve a set of gifts that we are not, as academics, naturally trained in, and for which we are not rewarded typically. We are trained in argument, in pursuing clarity, and making fine distinctions. We are rewarded for being right and being thought to be right. We're rewarded for the skills of one-upmanship. Furthermore, it's not just that we're not naturally trained in these skills of bridge building and translation, but part of our charge as Christian higher educators within the church, within the society, and I would argue even within the church, is to raise hard questions, to name things accurately, even when this is costly. In short, to be ourselves instruments of a certain kind of discord. So being agents of grace does not mean simply becoming more passive or more bland or a more lowest common denominator in our thinking, but it means cultivating intentionally the creativity and the character to ensure that discord or controversy is not the end of a discussion. And any of us who've been in the academy over the course of our lifetime know that there are lots of discussion stoppers that can just bring a discussion to an end. Our job, if we are going to be redemptive agents in our society and means of grace, must train ourselves in the creative, invitational, hospitable tasks of being hosts. Or I like to think of the metaphor of being docents in an art gallery. You know, let me show you how you can appreciate this thing that you originally thought was strange and maybe even bizarre. So, if we're going to be means of grace, we have to be intentional about it. It's going to be complicated. And finally, choosing to be agents of grace will be costly. I remember, two incidents in my own journey where I very reluctantly found myself doing administration. I was one of those faculty members who always thought administrators should be reluctant. I just never intended to become one of those reluctant administrators. And when I first became the provost at the institution in which I'd long been a faculty member, one of my good friends actually walked up to me and said, well, Shirley, you just have to know that now that you become an administrator, I'm not going to trust you. She just said that, just bluntly. And of course, we've all had the jokes about going over to the dark side. And I said to her, well, thank you for telling me that. I appreciate your candor in this. But I refer to this because I thought it would be easy going into the role of provost coming from the faculty. And there is an aloneness that you must have if you are going to be that agent that, again, Alison's already referred to, mediating faculty to the president and president to the faculty. So there's the cost of aloneness. And then when I, again, reluctantly, even more reluctantly actually, accepted the presidency at Houghton, my alma mater, a former chief academic officer at Houghton called me on the phone to tell me, I hope you know that becoming a president involves a dying. Now, I thanked him for this encouraging word, and I said, I thought he was talking in the more general way in which, for any Christian, our calling involves the taking up our cross daily. But I realized even more once I took the job that the presidency, which most people think of as a position of power, particularly those who aspire to it, was actually the most vulnerable position I ever occupied in the academic world. There's so much for which you are held responsible, for which you have no control. And part of the humbling aspect of this situation was that those, and I found out later that there were actually 6 people in the faculty of the college who had applied to be the president. So they're thinking about you as having achieved some prize that they wanted for this set of reasons. And so they're all assuming you're a power person. But you know inside that, no, this is costly. This is about, again, orchestrating. It's not about being right. There's hardly ever a time in the presidency when it's about applying all those tools of being right. It's about bringing people together, moving them forward. But then I want to suggest that it's not just in administrative roles that we're called to sacrifice if we're going to be people who mediate the work of Christian and higher education and love rather than power. There's a cost in every arena. We have all, Christian or not, and I'm flipping over now a bit more to the faculty side, been well trained in the tools of power, how to name drop, particularly those who've been in faculty meetings are trained with how you weaponize Robert's Rules of Order. If you haven't played that game, you all have watched other people play it. And I remember as a new president thinking, and you can't, by the way, tell these stories about these particular institutions because you know what at least the last one is, but I don't want you to report this back. But I thought I was prepared for the intensity of faculty meeting discourse. I had not seen anything like what I saw in the first faculty meeting I walked into. And I remember speaking afterwards to a senior faculty member, and I said, are you aware of how many people in that room are going to never speak because of the environment of one-upmanship that operates there? And this is a Christian college. And the person's response said, the person said to me, well, they just don't have the tools that it's going to take to survive in the academy. And I was somewhat flabbergasted, but I saw that he really believed that. It was not until a member of the faculty who would come out of the Mennonite tradition was elected faculty moderator. And I watched this person start very slowly to introduce the community intentionally to the tools that had come from that person's tradition of listening, of waiting, of being silent, of stepping aside. And she very methodically approached these tools. And at first, and once I saw what this person was doing, I tried to, again, follow up. Although as a president, you have to be very careful not being intrusive in the faculty meetings. But I wanted to support this person, and I know that that person took a lot of guff from the very colleagues who thought, well, no, it's about winning in faculty meeting. And so again, if we're going to be means of grace, it's an intentional choice, it's complicated, and it's going to be costly. People might think that you're not as smart as you could be. You have to resist sometimes doing the frontal thing of arguing back, even when you know you could. You have to choose, again, to do the mediating, to do the interpreting, to help everyone appreciate the gifts of those around them. So you have to adopt the posture of making others larger rather than the cutting off at the knees that we are also well trained in. So I believe with all my heart that Christian higher education can and ought to be a communal means of grace. And I don't want to be a downer on this because I am so struck by the possibility. But I just know it's not automatic. And so I want to contribute my few minutes here to focus on the fact that we have been entrusted with the tools to make this a possibility. Curiosity, the skills of acquiring knowledge, all of the things that Alison listed, and I won't repeat them. But it's only a possibility until each of us chooses to be intentional about employing these tools, not in a spirit of entitlement or to gather to our own advantage. And I've used poor Professor Parfit as our example of that here. We have to choose instead in a spirit of generosity and for the sake of our communities and the students and the church and society to adopt that position of gift and gratitude. This choice will involve creativity and it will be costly, but here's my closing comment. We need to go deep, not in a trite way, but deep into the heart of our enterprise and see the model of our Lord Jesus Christ, in whom are hidden all of the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. You know that from Colossians, but who also made himself of no reputation and took upon himself the form of a servant. You have to ask whether the Lord would have been able to get tenure at many of our institutions. He never wielded truth as a weapon for personal advantage, but rather embodied it in a way that made others see themselves more clearly, that made them larger, that helped them see their giftedness. He offered himself in that great exchange of grace by which the world has been made whole. And my challenge to myself today and to all of us in this room is that may we have the imagination and the courage to follow our Lord's countercultural example in the world of the academy so that we can do this work of translation in this moment of cultural polarization. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley and Alison and Joe. I'll give you a title to kind of frame my remarks, and the title is From Azusa Street to Carl F. H. Henry, question mark, exclamation point, and a subtitle, The Possibility of a Baptist Christian University as a Means of Grace in a Time of Culture Wars. The last time I was here at Baylor, I gave a talk at Truett on Baptist-Costalism, and that's one of the reasons why I thought this might be also a good opportunity for me to keep sort of ringing that bell a little bit. Plus the fact that I think, as I think many of us know who work in Christian higher educational institutions, more and more of our student bodies come from Baptistic or Pentecostal charismatic backgrounds, so there's a lot of that going on, not only in Baptist universities, but also, or only in Pentecostal universities, but across the board. And of course, this is the Carl F. H. Henry lecture, so I thought I'd at least try to weave in some Baptist-Costal theology into the conversation. Henry, for all of his renown in some evangelical circles, was also founding academic dean of Fuller Theological Seminary, where I work, in 1947, from where he then also played key roles in the reestablishing of Trinity Seminary as Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the 1960s. As our broader Faith and Culture Symposium Conference theme is called together in an age of discord, how might we be able to retrieve Henry's role as a leading Christian higher educator in the mid-20th century for our time? We can begin by noting how Henry did not shy away from controversial issues, but instead can be said to have pressed into them, at least some of them, particularly in his leading the so-called neo-evangelical coalition away from the fundamentalism of the 1930s and later. Remember, George Marsden's history of Fuller was titled Reforming Fundamentalism. And this was the next step for Henry, after he also helped with the establishment of the National Association of Evangelicals itself during the Second World War years. For Henry and others at Fuller and across the so-called fundamentalist movement, it was time to take up and engage with broader social issues. For instance, in his book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, also published in 1947, aggressive warfare, racial hatred and intolerance, the liquor traffic, exploitation of labor or management, and political naturalism. Like most academics, and finger pointing back at myself, theologians could call for engagement, but since we generally are not activists, we're less engaged with the actual work in these arenas. Henry was an institution builder, however, so he carried these calls with him, whether as a dean or faculty at Fuller, then later as founding editor of Christianity Today in 1956 or a long time after. And to be sure, if we actually begin to do the hard work of combating racism, engaging in labor reform, addressing regional wars, for instance, what's happening right now in the Middle East or Ukraine, working with immigrants or displaced populations, if we actually did all of these things or engaged in these activities, our theories or theologies will be honed by what is happening on the ground and how it's impacting the lives of real people. Now, as Henry was not an activist, yet he was instrumental 2 generations ago of at least calling for fundamentalist evangelical engagement on these issues. In these respects, Henry did not avoid discursive discord. In hindsight, he also ignited and even intensified some of that debate and contestation. And he did not ignore how those in his ecclesial coalition were at best neglecting and at worst themselves complicit in these various social injustices. As a theologian, however, Henry's primary work was in his writing and theological reflection. From here we can see how Henry understood the theological task to combat from his perspective and that generation's, these were questionable at best and corrosive at worst ideologies of secularism, humanism, Marxism. Seems like these enemies haven't gone away, have they? That persisted in the mid-20th century, not only in the wider educational space in North America, but even within the church and theological academy that he was navigating and emerging in more specifically. It was thus against these ideological ills that Henry devoted his intellectual energies and firepower, seeking to both arm younger neo-evangelical theological students and their churches with the apologetic resources to counter these ways of thinking. His 6-volume magnum opus, God, Evangelicals, and Authority, 1976 to 1983, summarized his lifelong grappling theologically and philosophically with these matters. seeking to secure a firm epistemological foundation for a biblical worldview to defend Christian doctrine and teaching against threats as he saw them that resisted taking every thought captive to the mind of Christ. Whatever else we might want to say about Henry's efforts, they can at least be recognized as valiant, attempting to deploy the master's rational tools of epistemological argumentation to deal with these modern master's realities, which he perceived as operating within the higher educational arena at the level of ideas. Many of us evangelicals who've been formed in the intervening decades since Henry's efforts may be a bit puzzled by his propositionalist, methodological, and hermeneutical approaches, and his concerns to secure the epistemic underpinnings of the evangelical theological endeavor. This reflects surely our own late modern, perhaps, or if not fully postmodern positionality, less driven by objective-subjective binaries and perhaps more open to intersubjective dynamics and negotiations. So this may or not also impinge on how we might clarify what hermeneutical and methodological options or strategies might be most appropriate to engage the culture wars of our age of discord. My point, however, is to at least give Henry the credit his due for exerting the kind of intellectual efforts evidenced across his oeuvre to address what he believed were the ideological constructs that attacked American society and the church more broadly, but also the evangelical theological enterprise more specifically. So these worrisome onslaughts had to be combated with the best thinking that he and his theological and journalistic colleagues could marshal. Now, what kinds of epistemic or other resources then might Henry perhaps be open to consider today if he were still around? Here I want to tap into one final area of the mid-20th century evangelical theological conversation to see how it might be relevant. I'm referring here to the overall consensus forged by Henry and his like-minded theological colleagues about the means of grace, the sub-theme for this panel. I'm not sure that Henry wrote much directly or substantively about the means of grace himself, and even some of what he might have said on the broader topic would have been argued in his more or less Baptistic theology of the ordinances as representational or symbolic enactments of prior divine works of grace that are inevitably encountered that inevitably he then countered through his countering of more sacramentalist conceptualizations of rites such as water baptism and the Holy Communion or Lord's Supper. So I mean that language ordinances is persistent across most Baptistic evangelical theologies rather than Eucharist, for instance. But in 1962, Henry edited a book under his name as sole editor, published by Baker, entitled Basic Christian Doctrines. And that included a chapter by Frank Gaebelein. Now, Gaebelein was a member of the Reformed Episcopal Church, who also was co-editor with Henry of Christianity Today for a time. And by the way, we have to thank Gaebelein for declining the invitation to be Fuller's founding academic dean, that in turn opened up the way for Henry to be appointed as the founding academic dean. But Gaebelein's chapter in Basic Christian Doctrines was titled Means of Grace, as a Reformed Episcopal theologian, right? Which shows that I guess we Wesleyans no longer own this notion of means of grace. But in any case, what we find there is a kind of generally accepted evangelical articulation, recognizing that besides baptism and the Lord's Supper, other means of grace deployed by the Holy Spirit, here, include the study of Scripture, the practices of prayer and worship and fellowship. These could be means through which divine grace envelops, sustains, and enables our lives, specifically through the work of the Spirit. Warms my Pentecostal heart. So, might Dr. Henry then agree to the following Pentecostal-like extrapolations of his own and Gaebelein's nurturing of the life of the mind, but now primed to engage the contested and divisive issues of our time in the 2020s. So, let me sketch briefly two aspects of what such a Baptist-Costal approach might include. First, Henry's evangelical rationalism, perhaps apropos for the predominantly white evangelical constituencies of the mid-20th century, might be updated with some pre-modern or postmodern or late modern pneumatic, charismatic, and Pentecost sensibilities in which human thinking, and therefore theologizing, are not only activities from the neck up, so to speak, but also embodied in communal endeavors. Here's how St. Luke describes the life of the Spirit that opens up to discursive communication in Acts 2. Where else would I go, right? This is New Revised Standard Version. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as a fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, these are Baptist ruminations, but Pentecost belongs neither to only Baptists nor to only Pentecostals. Note here then the perceptibility and kinesthetic dimensions of the Spirit's outpouring or infilling. Heard not only with eardrums, but with bodies situated in upper rooms, Barfield rooms, wherein the rushing violence resounds and reverberates, right? Resounding and reverberating are embodied perceptions rather than mere audio encounters. And then there is the seeing tongues of fire, the feeling of being alighted upon heads, and last but not least, the welling up from within now from our innermost being's bodies. So there is a multidirectionality of embodied experience and response. In other words, the Spirit's enacting of grace comes through our embodiment, our physical locatedness, our geographic situatedness, our material spatiality, our interrelational activity. What if Henry had also been an activist working with people of color in their then mostly impoverished neighborhoods, or with refugees or displaced peoples in their forced relocated environments, or with migrant laborers in the fields? These would have contributed praxis, performative, and affective aspects to his theory of mind, so that an even more biblically robust relational pneumatology could have been forged, one more available in our own time for our engagements with challenging issues. What if we as Christian educators created classroom, educational, and service learning spaces that facilitated relational activities, including those which stretched across ideological, cultural, religious, racial, economic, class, and political lines? Now, we can see how this Spirit-led or inspired epistemology unfolded further, and again, continuing on in Acts 2. Now, there were devout Jews from every nation living under heaven in Jerusalem, and at the sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one of them heard speaking in the native. Each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? How is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia and Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking of God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" Okay, make a few closing comments now. So Baptist-Costal, or universities like Baylor, or seminaries like Fuller, or other schools like many of those each of you work at, are arguably microcosms of how the streets of Jerusalem are described on the day of the initial outpouring, constituted by those derived from every nation, every group, every ethnicity under heaven. What the Spirit's leading then enables to ensue is a hearing that is beyond mere linguistic reason, but yet that's not irrational. A hearing of minds in bodies, and of bodies in motion in a shared educational or social space, navigating otherness and dissonance not just cognitively, but affectively and performatively, thus prompting and then being prompted by awe and amazement, curiosity and wonder, generating questions like, what does this mean? Further, what the Spirit's leading also enables is this intersubjective openness to the othered other. For Luke, Romans, in their imperial positionality vis-a-vis Judeans, or Cretans, the culturally other stereotyped in paradoxical terms as saying of themselves that they're always liars, and Arabs, the ethnic other, now separated by history and politics and so on. These othered others for Luke included now a new openness to listen to witnesses afresh, staying with those voices despite bewilderment and perplexity? How might we also press into the bewildering and perplexing spaces that hold us hold us together with political others, Republicans, Democrats as the case may be, or with ethnic and cultural others, red and yellow, black and white, and others as the case may be? How is all that held together, except by the Spirit? Perhaps as we create educational spaces that invite transformation of our gut, of our heart, which the Spirit reaches by traversing the fullness of our bodies, our communal upper rooms, our outer streets and public spaces, of our built and broader environments. And as we practice together, maybe we can also be ready to sit with, listen to, and discursively engage the witness of strange and even presumably alien and hostile other tongues in our age of discord.
Thank you all very much. We're going to turn things over to Q&A in just a moment, but first I want to give a chance for the three of you to respond or ask questions of each other, and then I have a question, because I'm up here, that I'm going to ask the entire panel, but then we'll open it up for Q&A, and we have, a good while still, about 35 minutes. So is there anything that the three panelists would like to ask one another or anything like that? Okay, well, I'd like to ask really a question for all three of you. First, I want to thank you. I didn't get to read these papers ahead of time, and I was furiously taking notes and writing down questions that I thought were just wonderful. Alison, I just love the way that you provided a couple of images to think about our universities, this idea of the ballast volume or the bunny duck or duck bunny. I especially like that ballast volume. And if y'all are not having questions to ask, I have some questions I'd love to ask you about that. And Shirley, deep reflection here on it sounds to me, if I could sort of, what I kept writing down was a sort of habituation into leadership that sees clearly the vices of power and sees also seeing oneself as a means of mercy in this position, and thinking about how to cultivate that in an institution. And I'm so struck, Amos, by the day of Pentecost as a vision for, in some ways, a ballast volume tank, messy, emotional, and diverse, as something that I want to continue to reflect on. But I have a general question. So we teach, I know, Amos, yours is a little different, but we teach undergraduates or theology students within certain institutional structures. And it seems to me that our institutional structures don't necessarily lend themselves to being means of grace. How would you grade the reception of grace or the movement of the Spirit? What sort of reward systems are there for being means of grace, this sort of thing? I just simply point that out, right? But then this is the bigger question. So does this thinking of, in some ways, our academic vocations as providing means of grace, does that make the line between educational institutions that have their own set of aims, does that make the sort of boundary between educational institutions and the church too porous? I've not served Eucharist in my classroom, right? A means of grace. And so I'm just sitting here thinking about that, thinking, Amos, how would we grade the Spirit warming one's heart